So I'll be talking today about how we can improve clinical trial reporting. And I'm going to give some perspectives from Europe and the US. And I think it's a really interesting field because clinical trial reporting is pretty bad, but it's rapidly getting better. So I don't want to just harp on about how bad everything is, but I also want to talk about how things are improving, why they are improving, and how we can improve them further. So this is the structure of the talk. In the first wave, I'll just talk quickly about the problems with clinical trial reporting and why it matters. And I'll highlight some solutions that actually work. Then we'll go on to questions. And after that, there's a second slot where I'll be talking about progress in Europe and the US. And then the grandiosely titled How to Change the World, what we can learn from the progress that we've observed. So I'm going to start off with a classic study by Eric Turner and colleagues that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2008. There are literally dozens of studies along these lines, but I think this one is the all-time classic, so I'll run with it. And he looked at pivotal trials of antidepressant drugs, 12 different antidepressant drugs, and he had a look in the medical literature. And what he found in the medical literature was reports of 52 clinical trials. 49 trials of these antidepressants had positive results and only 3 trials had negative results. So if you look at the box, the positive trials are in green, the negative ones are in red. So these medicines really, if you look at the academic literature, look effective. You know, they do more harm than good. There's very little doubt about that. Only 3 trials had negative results. I mean, that's statistical noise. Now, what he did then is he looked at the Food and Drug Administration systems and how the Food and Drug Administration people, how they had evaluated the trials. So what they saw is they saw 74 trials in total. 38 trials had positive results and 36 trials had negative results. So if you represent that graphically, you see you got a very balanced picture. Do these antidepressants actually help people? Well, you know, maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's a very mixed picture. So the big question is, what happened here? You know, we know from the FDA that 74 clinical trials were conducted, but in the academic literature, we can only see 52 trials. And Eric Turner broke this down really neatly. So he said, first of all, there's publication bias. And we know from various studies around the world that around half of all clinical trials never make their results public. So you can see that here, a large chunk of trials are simply missing from the literature. Another thing that we know from multiple studies is that trials with negative results are far less likely to get published. And again, this data set bears it out. So you can see that one of the positive trials was not published, but in contrast, 22 of the negative trials were not published. So let's look at this side by side. Once we've taken publication bias into account, it explains a lot of the difference, but it doesn't explain all of the difference here. So what happened? And it's simply evidence distortion. I mean, other people call it spin, and that's when negative trials misreport the outcomes as positive in a journal publication. So it's putting lipstick on a pig. And in that case, it was 11 negative trials that were reported as positive in the journal publication. I'll go through 2 examples now of why this actually matters and why we should care about it. And I think the most famous example is Tamiflu, which was developed as a drug in case there was an influenza pandemic. So there was a big scare about a possible influenza pandemic earlier on this century. The pandemic never happened, but governments started stockpiling these medicines in case it did happen. And after they started stockpiling, there were warning signs and warning noises saying that, well, maybe Tamiflu isn't as good as we thought it was. And what happened there was that the results of 8 clinical trials of Tamiflu hadn't been published. They hadn't been made public anywhere. Those 8 trials, unsurprisingly, were the more negative trials. By that time, $18 billion had been spent on Tamiflu, and 96 countries had stockpiled enough Tamiflu for 350 million people. So if the big one, which we're living through now, if it had struck back then, governments' response plans would partially have relied on a medicine that was essentially useless. The second example, which in a way is even more tragic, is the example of Lorcanide and other antiarrhythmic drugs, which were prescribed to patients who'd had heart attacks in the US. And in the case of Lorcanide, it was just one small academic trial that didn't get reported. And that trial, in hindsight, could have provided an early warning sign that these medicines were actually not helping patients. And the academic team that led the trial did everything right. They completed the trial, they looked at the results, they analyzed the results, they went from one journal to the next, and each journal rejected them because they said, oh, this is just a small trial, it's not particularly interesting, etc., etc. Later, it turned out that 20,000 to 75,000 people died every year in the United States alone because of this medication. And this small academic trial was really the first warning sign that something was wrong, because the deaths in the treatment group were simply really high, but it was just a small trial. But if that trial had been made public, maybe the alarm bells would have sounded 1 or 2 years earlier, and each year here translates into 20,000 to 75,000 lives. So yeah, this matters. It matters to patients, it matters to public health. It also matters to taxpayers who might be paying for ineffective drugs or for medicines that do more harm than good. And it also matters to science, because a lot of clinical researchers are simply repeating work that's already been done by other teams, not knowing that they're running down a dead end. So they're wasting maybe 2-3 years of their lives to run a clinical trial that maybe somebody in India or in Japan performed a few years earlier, but that never got made public. So the solution to all this, in theory, is quite simple. You have clinical trial registries where every single trial has to be registered before it starts, so that it can afterwards never again disappear from the global knowledge map again. The largest trial registry is clinicaltrials.gov, which I believe is very widely used in Canada as well as in the US, and is very widely used in Europe for non-drug trials. Then we have the European Union Clinical Trials Register, and we have several other trial registries around the world, which are all linked up by the World Health Organization. So you can search for trials systematically through these individual trial registries. And one thing that a lot of these registries do is they enable you to upload the results of a trial in tabular format or as a PDF or as a journal article when you finish the trial. So reporting on results on registries comes a bit difficult to a lot of academics because there are no publication records for this. It doesn't further their career. There are no incentives to do this, but there are huge advantages to reporting results on registries. First of all, it's the only guaranteed solution that a clinical trial will not remain unreported, because you can spend years running from one journal to the next journal to the next journal, and then suddenly the principal investigator retires, the data set gets lost, and then the trial is lost forever. While on a trial registry, you have control over the process. You can just upload the results. There's no journal gatekeeper in between there. There is usually a quality control mechanism by the regulator running the registry, but you can put the results up there as soon as they're ready. That makes results sharing a lot faster. There are studies showing that data, especially data on drug harms, are more complete and accurate in trial registries than they are in journal articles. And finally, the whole thing is open access, so anyone can look at data on a trial registry. And in 2017, the World Health Organization issued the joint statement on public disclosure of results from clinical trials, and that really sets out the gold standard for trial reporting worldwide. And it's quite a short document, and there are three main ideas in there. And the first one is that all interventional clinical trials should be pre-registered. While the trial is ongoing, the registry data should be kept up to date. For example, saying, well, we've suspended the trial now for half a year, or we've terminated it early. And then when the trial has been completed, the results should be uploaded onto the registry within 12 months of trial end. So some very simple, very clear rules. Because of the huge cost of patients and to the public of unregistered and unreported trials, there have been a lot of partial solutions floating around, and these solutions do work to an extent, but they're partial solutions. And the first one is put into place really by medicines regulators and by the law. So in the United States, certain types of clinical trials have to be pre-registered. The results must be uploaded within 12 months. And if you don't do that, you face a fine of over $11,000 a day that a trial result is not made public. In the European Union, since 2014, there's been a guideline saying the same thing, essentially. Within 12 months of trial completion, the results have to go up there. But this only applies to medicines trials, and that will become national law in all European Union member states from February next year. And then India and various other countries have similar rules on the books. Why are these partial solutions? I think there's two big limiting factors. And the first one is a kind of regulatory tunnel vision. So the US law does not cover all clinical trials. The European Union regulation only covers trials of investigative medicinal products. So if, for example, you're running a clinical trial with hip replacements, with pacemakers, no matter how important it is to patients, it does not fall under EU reporting requirements. And the second one is simply lack of enforcement. I mean, we haven't seen a single fine yet, a single fine collected either in the US or in Europe for failure to make clinical trial results public. That might be changing soon. I'll return to that later. But so far, really, regulators and the law have been turning a blind eye to that. And it's a massive problem. The second partial solution is with research funders, and they really work from the joint statement put out by the World Health Organization. And what the joint statement says, the basic idea behind this is really simple. If you hand out money for a clinical trial, you should be requiring the people running the trial to pre-register it and to put its results onto a registry within 12 months. And then really importantly, and this is crucial, research funders should afterwards check whether this has actually happened. And I'm happy to say that some of the research funders who signed up to this, they have done this. So if you go onto the Wellcome Trust website, you can find like their monitoring report for the clinical trials that they have funded. The same applies to the Medical Research Council in the UK, and the same applies to the National Institute of Health Research in the UK. I mean, these are three really large funders, and they are doing the right thing already. And I think it's huge progress. And for those of you from Canada, the Canadian Institute of Health Research signed up to the WHO joint statement about half a year ago. So by the end of this year, they should have the policies in place, and they should also be producing monitoring reports. Whether they actually put the policies in place and actually produce the monitoring reports, we will find out at the end of the year, because, for example, Gates Foundation signed up for this. I haven't seen a monitoring report from Gates Foundation yet. There is a wonderful paper written by somebody from the Medical Research Council that really lays out, it's like a how-to manual for funders on how to identify trials, how to set up a monitoring system, how the whole process works. So for those of you who are interested in this, I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. A big limitation of this is if you're going through research funders, you will not capture industry trials. So again, this is a partial solution. It's super valuable. It really moves the needle, but it doesn't get us to 100%. Okay, another one is universities, and we're seeing a lot of progress by universities across the US and Europe. The basic principle is the same as with the research funders. You need an oversight of what's happening in your institution. So with universities, the process starts very simply. One person in the institution, as part of their job description, gets the role of overlooking trial registries, overlooking trial entries by the university, making sure that trials all get registered, and then also following up with individual investigators when the results are due and saying, you know, please upload the results. And really importantly, this is a constructive role. This is not a punitive or regressive role. This is really a role in which one person helps all researchers to do the right thing. And in the US, there's a network of universities that help each other by these people who've got the oversight. They run monthly webinars on that. Their clinical trial registration results reporting task force. It's a brilliant model. There's a group in Europe that plans to set up a similar task force in Europe in the near future. There's also a very recent publication from Johns Hopkins University, which explains in detail how they created a program to do this and how it works. And then by my own university in Berlin, there is a manual for European universities and university hospitals. And even if you're not in Europe, if you look at the US publication and if you look at the European publication, I think they really chart out a detailed roadmap on how institutions can get this done. The reason this is only a partial solution is because you're always going to get some black sheep. You know, a lot of universities are going to do this. Some universities are not going to do this. And then again, we might get one Lorcanide style trial unreported. So the partial solutions have the limitations that they usually don't apply to all clinical trials. They're not properly enforced. They exclude industry, or sometimes if they come from regulators, they exclude non-commercial research. And then you've got the black sheep problem. And that could be black sheep funders, like Gates Foundation is at the moment, or it could be black sheep universities or black sheep pharma companies. And I think there's only one strategic choke point, really, one strategic gatekeeper where every single clinical trial must pass through. And that is the ethics approval process. No matter who funds it, no matter who runs it, every single clinical trial run in the world has to get ethics approval. So the normal process is you design a trial, you get ethics approval for it, you register the trial, you run the trial, and afterwards you report the results. And it's from the Declaration of Helsinki 2013 onward, it's a global ethics requirement to pre-register your trial and to make its results public. The problem with these gatekeepers is that ethics committees usually have pretty low capacity. So what they tend to do is they say, well, you know, we'll approve the trial on the condition that you promise to register it or that you promise to report results. But then as soon as they've given the approval, you know, their job finishes and they walk away. And the result is that nobody afterwards checks whether the trial was actually registered or reported. And I've got some data here from the UK to show how this gatekeeping mechanism fails. So since 2013 in the UK, if you're seeking ethics approval, you have to promise to register a clinical trial. You have to even sign to that effect. But in 2016, over 30% of clinical trials run in the UK still weren't being registered because people signed, but then they forgot. I mean, we're all human, you know, if it's not a watertight system, you know, people will forget. Also, from the Declaration of Helsinki since 2013, you have to make the results public. A large German study found that 28% of all clinical trials run by German universities remain completely unreported. So you can't find the results on a registry, you can't find the results in a journal. 28% of clinical trials simply wind up as research waste. This is wasted money. I mean, the end deliverable of a clinical trial is not finishing the trial. The end deliverable of a clinical trial is the publication, so people can learn from it, so that they can influence clinical practice. So the UK has now developed a strategy that should provide the first really watertight system in the world. And I'm really optimistic that this is going to work. So what happens? First of all, ethics approval proceeds as usual. And I think this is a really important element of the strategy. If you're running a clinical trial in the UK in future, this new transparency strategy will not create more red tape for you. You will not have to fill out extra forms. You will not have to wait for longer delays than in the past. You simply do what you've been doing anyway. But after your trials received ethics approval, all the ethics approvals are centrally archived in an office in London. And then once a year in London, somebody will go through all these centrally archived ethics approvals and will simply check, was this clinical trial that was approved, was it really registered? And then later, were the results reported, yes or no? And if the results haven't been reported or the trial wasn't registered, they will follow up with the person who received the ethics approval until the trial has been registered and the results have been made public. And this system really covers trial registration and results reporting in one stroke. And importantly, like I said, no additional red tape. The cost of implementing this on a national level is going to be less than $1 million US. I mean, this is absolute peanuts compared to the 18 billion that was spent on Tamiflu. So that's the end of the first tranche. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be really happy to answer.
All right. Well, Atil, there's like a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to read them out because we're recording. So the first question comes from Christopher Taylor, who asks, do you think that the incentives for reporting differ between continents and or countries? And is culture as important as legislation?
I don't really like the talk about culture change with clinical trials, because if you look at things like sexual harassment in academia, it's very clear this is unacceptable. This is completely unacceptable. Nobody talks about culture change with sexual harassment. Nobody talks about, oh, let's just wait 20 years until all the old people have retired and then things will be fine, you know? There are very, very clear rules, you know, and if you break those rules, you know, you will be called out for breaking those rules, you know, and there will be consequences. So I've got very little patience with the culture change approach, because people have been talking about culture change since the 1980s. And in the UK, you know, we've had really high profile, loud discussions about this issue for over 10 years. And still 30% of clinical trials go unreported. So yeah, I do think you will get changes in awareness between different countries and continents. I think you will get changes in incentives. For example, at some US universities, if you haven't put the results of your clinical trial up onto the US trial registry as required by the law, you will get a call from the dean of the medical faculty who will say, look, you know, this is a regulatory requirement and I expect this to happen. So I don't think it's fair to patients to talk about culture change, because culture change takes a lot of time, you know. Culture change is important, you know. I mean, culture change is what preceded the smoking ban in restaurants, you know. There were discussions, there was public education. This is really important, but I just feel we've gone beyond the point of culture change. You know, at some point we got to say, okay, we've talked enough about this, and we really need to just put into place watertight systems. And when I say watertight systems, It's not about punishing people. It's about supporting people. It's about making sure that they follow the rule. It's about supporting them actively in following the rules. There's nothing punitive about this, but it's just like sexual harassment is not okay. It's not tolerated at this institution. Failure to register clinical trials is not okay, and it's not tolerated at this institution. And that is the bottom line. If you want to do cultural change around that, I think you're totally welcome. But, there needs to be a hard bottom line.
Great. So Tom Perry has a comment. He says, Canada still has no sunshine law for disclosure of commercial support, and I know of no disincentive to ghostwriting. So it's still possible to gain prominence, be very influential, and perhaps to gain academic promotion from publications, which the ostensible PI or PIs had little or nothing to do. And certainly no guarantees that they understood the experiment. We're knowledgeable about what happened to the patients or had access to help analyze the data.
Yeah, this is something that's outside my area of expertise, so I'm not going to comment on it. I think it's a dynamic that's well documented. What does fall slightly within the area where I work is the case where a pharmaceutical company funds a clinical trial by a university, and then the company says, well, no, we don't give you permission to publish the results. And that's again where culture change is not really helpful. It's something where you can just say, sorry, at our institution, we've got very clear rules. The results go up onto registries within 12 months. And that's just the rules of the game. If you want to play with us, those are the rules. And if you don't want to play by those rules, sorry, goodbye.
Yeah, great. Okay, so then Raquel Billones says recent data show that reporting by the industry has improved, but the academia is still lagging behind. Is the academic publish or perish culture driving the latter, especially since positive results are more likely to be published?
I think industry is a really different beast from academia. I mean, if you're looking at a pharmaceutical company, you're looking at a vertically integrated organization where there's somebody on top who's actually in charge. While academia is more like a sort of, medieval agglomeration of fiefdoms with a nominal king at the head. So it's much easier for pharma companies to clean up their act on this. And there's been a lot more public pressure on pharma companies to clean up their act. I think it's completely unacceptable these days for a pharma company not to make its clinical trial results public. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that was the norm. So I think there's been a strong change in expectations there, and I think the large industry players have really done a good job at meeting those expectations. But what we can also see is that there are problems still in the pharmaceutical industry when you go down to the mid-sized and smaller companies, where even compliance with laws like the US law, like the European Union requirements, is still weak amongst those players because they're not in the public eye and they might not even understand what the rules there are exactly. So, the problem in industry is by far not solved because of these medium-sized and smaller companies. But yes, overall, industry performs better than academia at this. But I think if you want to look for the explanation of that, it's more helpful to look at industry than academia. And also, I mean, the way some major pharmaceutical companies handle this is they simply outsource this to specialist disclosure companies. So they just give them a heap of money and say, well, can you please take care of that? That's an option that academia doesn't have. So with academia, it's more challenging to put the solutions into place. And until a few years ago, there simply hasn't been the sort of public pressure on them.
Great. And so then we have another question by Joseph Klein, who says, do other countries show political interest movement to implement a similar system like just presented for the UK and hopefully enforce it?
That's why I'm giving this talk. I hope that some people will come out of this talk and will say, hey, well, why don't we do that in my country? As far as I know, no other countries picked up on it yet, but also the UK strategy was only adopted about a year and a half ago. It hasn't been fully implemented yet, but I think that really is the gold standard going forward. And I think, as we push for greater transparency, we might do a tactical push left and tactical push right. But, if we're looking at the sort of finish line that we're pushing towards, I think it has to look somewhat like the UK system unless somebody comes up with something better.
Great. And then we have a comment again from Raquel Billionaires, who says that, just to comment, the Declaration of Helsinki recommendations to publish results, positive as well as negative, goes way back to the 2000 version.
Okay, I'll check that out. If I got that wrong, apologies.
Okay. And then David Shikaze, please, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, please accept my apologies. Can you comment on a system where academic journals guarantee publication after submission of protocol, but before results are obtained?
Yeah, I mean, that's called registered reports. Registered reports originally came out, they were developed by a psychologist based in Cardiff in Wales as a concept, and they've been taken up now by dozens of journals. And personally, I find it really hard to understand why clinical trials are not all published as registered reports by now. But if you're going into the landscape of academic publishing, you're talking about thousands of players, and you will never build any kind of watertight system through academic publishers because it's just too large and diverse a field. But yeah, I mean, for everyone interested in that, I think it's a brilliant concept. And if you're working for a journal, there's a lot of guidance on how you can offer registered reports. And that's definitely a way to get around publication bias, where positive studies are more likely to make their results public than negative studies. But it doesn't solve the problem where, for example, you have a company saying, no, you can't make the results public, or the problem where a PI afterwards says, oh, well, these results weren't that exciting, so even though I've got a publication guaranteed, I'd rather run the next clinical trial.
Okay, so there's just two small comments, which I'll just mention, but then Millie has a question. So I think Dr. Helen Tremlett says she submitted to a journal, but said unless the response was positive, or sorry, the results were positive, then they weren't interested in publishing. So that's actually quite interesting. Hopefully, Helen, that wasn't too long ago, or that was a long time ago, not recently. And then Allison said Health Canada has identified this as part of their open public consultation for modernization of their clinical trial regulations. Please comment by July 4th. So if anybody wants to comment, I think Allison has posted the link down in the chat. And then we have a question from Millie, who says, who supervises the questions asked of the people taking part in the clinical trials? Depending on the questions, for example, about mood, there may be no mention of psychiatric ADRs, which is the field I'm interested in. I know a person who is writing up questions and knows they can be designed to avoid such ADRs, and of course withdrawal effects and dependence are not looked for. So, is there a move to make more psychiatric ADRs to make sure psychiatric ADRs are included? The FDA requested all drugs should be checked for suicide risks some years ago, but it was not a mandatory requirement.
Again, this is outside my area of expertise, but if you're looking at the reporting of ADRs and you're looking at a typical journal article, I mean, there's simply not enough space to account for all ADRs in detail, and that's why multiple studies have found that ADRs are reported more completely in trial registries. And about that journal editor who said, oh, I'm only going to publish it when the results are positive. I mean, that's absolutely disgusting, but I don't want to wait for another years for culture change for that guy to retire. I think this shows the limitations of culture change. Most journal editors are probably a bit more clued in than that by now, but if the person who made that comment wants to guest blog about that on the Transparamed website, I'd be really happy to run it.
Great. Okay, so Eva says the ICMGE requires trial registration as a condition for the publication of research results generated by a clinical trial. Any comment?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The ICMGE requires trial registration as a condition for the publication of research results generated by a trial. Any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really positive initiative. After the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors put out that requirement, we saw a really steep rise in trial registrations. At the same time, as I said, medical journals are an incredibly huge and diverse population. Elizabeth Loader of the BMJ wrote a great paper a couple of years back, where she looked at, I think it was 100 clinical trial reports that were submitted to the BMJ, and that the BMJ had rejected because they didn't meet the pre-registration requirement that all journals should follow. And she followed it up, and I think over 95% eventually wound up getting published in a different journal. So again, it's a great initiative, and it takes us a long way towards improving things, but it doesn't get us over the finish line of 100% registered.
Great. And then Derek asks, how valuable is the patient voice in changing transparency?
Hugely valuable, because I'll get to that in the second tranche of the presentation.
Finally, by Christopher, a comment about the future UK system. The Health Research Authority is exploring how to link its information systems with the ISR CTN registry with a view to streamlining the registration process for clinical trials reviewed by UK ethics committees. This could open the way for the registry to collaborate with the HRA in detecting overdue results.
Yeah, and that is part of the overall transparency strategy in the UK. And what is really fantastic in the UK is how you have the Health Research Authority working together with the main government funders, with the ISR CTN trial registry, with various other stakeholders, to really create an integrated, streamlined system that creates as little red tape and as little paperwork as possible, while still delivering like really high quality and a lot of transparency. And I mean, we'll see what happens over the next couple of years, but I think so far what's been happening in the UK is really super impressive. And I think if you look at the recovery trial for COVID treatments, you know, that trial didn't come out of the blue. You couldn't have run that trial just in any country. That wasn't some genius who just wrote the protocol and make it happen. You know, that was the result of over a decade of really hard work by the Health Research Authority, by funders in the UK, by really everyone to just integrate and line up systems. You know, so the whole UK strategy is premised on the idea of just normalizing transparency and just normalizing quality, rather than everyone having a system of their own.
Wonderful. Okay, so that's the end of the questions, but I also just want to mention that if you go over, we could stay for as long as we want, up until 1:30. So just want to mention that.
Okay, cool. I'll try not to keep everyone from their lunch or dinner, depending where they are. So I'll just go through the next slides quickly. So we've just talked about why it matters and sort of solutions that work, partial solutions and a watertight solution. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the progress we've seen in Europe and the USA, and then why that progress happened and what we can learn from it going forward. So progress in the pharma industry. I had a look at the 33 companies that make up the pharma lobby group in the US, 32% of those companies have put every clinical trial result that they should have by law up onto the US trial registry. So by these large pharma companies, really now, we're seeing very strong legal compliance. You know, for trials that fall outside the law, we don't know if they voluntarily do the right thing, but they do tend to stick to the law. Same thing in Europe on the European Trial Registry, where again, there's a regulatory requirement. You can see the reporting rates here for the companies with the largest amounts of trials. Ideally, you want them all to be at 100%. You can see that Roche of Tamiflu fame is just at 92.5%. So if you got time after this, you know, just go on Twitter for a minute and ask Roche what they're doing and why they're dragging their feet, why they're lagging behind the rest. But overall, I think, you know, large industry players are doing really well, and that's been due to public pressure more than anything else. Progress in academia, the 10 non-commercial trial sponsors in the US with the largest number of trials are all uploading results as required by law, and most of them have uploaded 100% of clinical trial results that they should have uploaded according to law. That's huge progress made over the last 2 years. It's really impressive. Europe is hanging behind, but of the top 10 institutions, 7 are now visibly tackling the problem, and some of them are doing it rapidly. So with the top institutions in academia, they're really all going with this now. Let's look at Germany as an example. So in December 2019, all German universities combined had uploaded 32 clinical trial results to the European Trial Registry. Absolutely dismal. Little more than a year later, they'd already uploaded 256 results. So again, rapid improvement. If you're looking at a breakdown by universities, this data is a bit old, but it shows that a majority of universities are now working on this. As usual, you've got a few black sheep, but the black sheep tend to be like very small universities. The major players are all working on this now. With regulators, we're also seeing progress. The FDA has started the process of sending out warning letters, and the warning letters give institutions 30 days to put up missing clinical trial results. If they fail to do that, they're facing a fine of $11,000 a day. No fine has been issued yet, but the warning letters have started going out, and this law's been on the books since 2007. So it took until 2021 for the FDA to send out the first warning letter, but now finally they're doing it. In Europe, again, slightly behind, regulators are now talking about it. And the European Union, if you imagine a coalition of 27 member states, you know, they can talk forever, but it's definitely moving in the right direction there as well. And then, of course, in the UK, as already mentioned, we've got the Make It Public strategy, which you can Google and download. And the slogan is make transparency easy, make transparency the norm, make information public. And this is a really huge achievement. And it was preceded by a lengthy consultation. This wasn't just made up by someone. It was a lengthy consultation process, and this really is a super strong strategy. So why are things changing positively in the US? Well, first of all, thanks to Nicholas DeVito and his colleagues at the University of Oxford, Ben Goldacre should be named prominently there. We've got the FDA Trials Tracker, which tracks in real time, more or less, who is sharing clinical trial results that fall under US disclosure laws. So you can go onto the FDA Trials Tracker, you can type in the name of any institution, any pharma company, and you can see how well they're doing, and it's constantly getting updated. So there's very, very clear performance data out there. But on top of that, there's been universities allied for essential medicines. They've been fighting this corner for many years now with significant success, and they've just put out reports where they rank the major US universities on whether they put up their, whether they report their results as they have to according to law or whether they don't. And it's a very simple ranking process. They put out a study 2 years ago. They put out another one earlier this year. You can see a strong improvement between those years. But that sort of thing really gave visibility again. It's visibility, and it's not just visibility of who's doing badly, but it's also visibility who's doing well. Because I think a purely negative approach doesn't really provide as many incentives as a positive and negative approach. I mean, if an institution or a pharma company is doing the right thing, I mean, why not say something positive about it? And I think universities allied for essential medicines have been doing a great job at that. Then you've got from Yale Law School, you've had people doing strategic litigation to try and force the FDA's hand to finally impose files. So they've been going through the courts. And then an activist journalist recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, reminding Joe Biden that when he was vice president many years ago, he promised to fix this problem, and he hasn't fixed it yet. And coincidentally, less than a week after that opinion piece was printed, the FDA put out the statement saying, oh yeah, we're sending out warning letters now. So I think you've got this combination of data, media outreach, court action, more media outreach. Let's have a look at why are things happening now in Germany. First of all, again, Nicholas De Vito and Ben Goldacre at the University of Oxford also built an EU trials tracker. So now we get monthly updated performance data for each institution, which shows us who's doing well, who's doing badly. Together with a German group, we just pulled together the results there for the German universities, and we did a ranking, and we had a media partnership with one of the largest German newspapers, who in turn had a partnership with a broadcaster. And when that report came out, it really went through all the media. I mean, local newspapers were picking up on how well or how badly their university was doing, and it really served as a wake-up call. And it really got a lot of positive things going. And in the UK, similar picture. First of all, the EU Trials Tracker comes out. Then, coincidentally, at the same time the EU Trials Tracker was launched, UK Parliament was already running an inquiry into research integrity. And when they saw the Trials Tracker data, they decided to do a standalone inquiry just on clinical trial transparency. And then there were a lot of groups that just provided evidence to that. And the evidence wasn't just, oh no, there's a problem, but the evidence that they got was also, okay, here are some possible ways to fix the problem. So if you're looking at the UK national strategy, it came out of this parliamentary inquiry, and a lot of elements in the strategy were proposed by groups like Healthwatch UK, again, Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and Stop AIDS, and various other groups that pitched in for that. So I think the lesson we learned from that is that as a starting point, you do need journal papers. You need papers that just describe the problem, quantify the problem, and say, okay, we've got a problem. And you also need the sort of whole academic circuit where, a lot of meta-researchers or bioethicists sit together in a room and all agree that there's a problem, But this is only a starting point. And I think the cautionary tale here is the book Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre. I mean, when Bad Pharma came out in the UK, this was a bestseller. It sold, in a country of 60 million people, it sold 1 million copies. I mean, this was really read by everyone in medical research, loads of patients, loads of members of parliament. And I think back then Ben Goldacre thought, well, I've said it, and now things have to change. But in reality, even this fantastic book by itself was just a starting point. Publications do not solve problems. If publications solve problems, all problems in the world would already be solved. So how do we get towards the finishing line of actually getting solutions in place? And when I'm looking at the landscape in the US and in various European countries, you see a pattern of how change happens. And the first thing is really going to the public with this, going outside the academic circle and just say, hey, is this okay? Is this okay that, some trials only make their results public after 4 years, other trials never make their results public at all, some of them might just not fully report adverse events in journal articles, is any of this okay? And every time this gets into the media, and I think this is something, it's very easy to get blind to this if you're working in the clinical trials sphere, if you're working in academia where we sort of take pride in problematizing things, as soon as the public and policymakers realize what's happening, they say, no, this is absolutely not okay. And that's a starting point, You've got a problem, it's not okay, and it needs to be fixed. And then the next one is, you can't just do this with academics, you need a really, really diverse team. You need academics who sort of provide the data and the analysis. You also need think tanks or campaign groups that are more involved with the policy process. You need patient groups who speak up, patients who go to the media and say, well, actually, I'm a cancer patient. I'm speaking with some patients who've got metastatic breast cancer. They've only got a few years to live. They don't have much patience for investigators who think it's okay to wait 4 years to make a trial result public, And then you also need activists, like student activists from UAM. They painted with big chalk outside one German university, Leipzig University, just in giant letters with chalk, University of Leipzig, where are your clinical trial results? And today, Leipzig is the university in Germany with the best trial reporting record. And, you really need to go out to the media, you need to go out to policymakers, and that requires a coalition. And we're seeing more and more Cochrane national chapters in various countries becoming involved with this, Transparency International chapters, patient groups, health groups, access to medicines groups. And I think diversity is really the key, just having a loose coalition where everyone can play a different role and bring their different strengths. Writing letters, a journalist friend of mine said, never underestimate the power of a letter, If you think this is not okay, well, why not just write an email to your member of parliament and say, can we meet? Can we have a chat about this for 20 minutes? Because I think this is not okay, and I assume you don't think it's okay. Going through the media, absolutely essential. If it's not in the newspaper for a policymaker, it's not important. Policymakers juggle 100 different difficult issues every day. Oh, what are we going to do about the civil war in Ethiopia? What are we going to do about unemployment? What are we going to do about agricultural regulation? So if you want to get clinical trials onto their radar, onto their to-do list, you need to go through the media. And then you just need to keep on the ball. We saw that in the UK, where in 2013, after Bad Pharma came out, the book, there was a parliamentary inquiry. The parliamentary inquiry made a lot of fantastic recommendations. And then a few years later, we had a second parliamentary inquiry by the same committee, and they found out that none of their recommendations had been adopted. And the same thing goes for research funders, the same thing goes for journals, the same thing goes for institutions. You just really have to keep monitoring it, keep tracking it. And I think the final thing is, you really need to make clear that this problem is not going to go away, and you're not going to go away until the problem is solved. You need to say, okay, we've done a ranking of universities now, and we're going to do the next ranking a year from now. And I think it's also good, because if a university or a pharma company or a funder perform badly in a ranking, they've got a chance to actually come out on top in next year's ranking. They don't get stuck with this label of, oh, they're really bad at clinical trial reporting. It's a much more dynamic environment. And then when you go back, you look at the data again, and then you ask again, well, is this okay now? Have we, is this problem solved now, or is this still a problem? And if it's still a problem, you just have to run through the same loop again. And it takes a few years, but it's really worth it. I mean, if you're looking at the progress in Europe and the US, these things take years, but at the end, you get a real benefit for patients and you get a real benefit for science. So if you want an overview of various studies that have found problems with clinical trials, on the Transparency website, you can find the document Clinical Trial Transparency Guide for Policymakers that was published by Transparency International and Cochrane. And you're also really welcome to email me. But if you've got any questions now, please just shoot ahead.
His question was, what is the scientific chaos during COVID? Oh, was the scientific chaos during COVID helpful to promote this problem to the public and politics, or was it rather a minor issue on the side compared to all the other issues?
Well, I mean, it was a big issue in terms of science. It was a huge problem with research waste. I mean, it really highlighted all the problems that we knew existed before. I think it wasn't very useful in driving for positive change because policymakers over the last year and a bit have had zero bandwidth. It seems, this is a long-term problem. And if they could have fixed it with a wave of the one, they would have fixed it with a wave of the one. But it's a long-term problem, and trying to get people during a pandemic to fix a long-term problem is not helpful. But I mean, we're already starting to see with COVID trials, they're no different from all other clinical trials. We're starting to see all the problems with registration reporting that we've seen with others, and with research chaos as well. And I mean, my big hope is that the recovery trial will really cause a lot of people to look at the UK and see, well, what did they get right? And part of what they got right was transparency. So I hope that's going to be a vehicle for positive change.
Great. I think there's just a lot of like kind of links that people have shared, like which is really awesome in the chat. But actually, I have a question. So, say for example, like our university where we're at here, which is the University of British Columbia, like there's not been any kind of like movement towards like having the university become more responsible for getting clinical trial results reported. Is there any kind of like sort of, I guess, advocacy plans that are out there, like where that we can like, a pre-existing plan for, going and trying to make this possible within our university, getting results, like a kind of a knowledge translation plan or advocacy plans that we can implement?
Well, I think the best group to go through there would be Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, North America, who've done a huge amount of work over many years on this in the US, and they've done it really, really successfully. And I think that would be my first port of call, instinctively, for changing things in Canada. Another one is if Cochrane has a national chapter in Canada, I'd get in touch with them, because they are part of a global network, and a lot of other Cochrane people are working on this in different countries. And take a look at the Transparency website as well, because I try and keep track of what different groups are doing all around the world, and you can copy models from that. But Universities Allied for Essential Medicines have recently developed a tracker that should be adaptable to conditions in Canada. So just look at what they've done in the US, in the UK, in Germany, and other countries. And I think there's nothing like a very simple rating and ranking of like, the top 20 Canadian universities, have they put their results up there? Yes, no, go to the media, big headline, and then also help them, just say, well, this is how university fixed it in the US. Can we introduce you to people who are doing this work in the US? Can we introduce you to people in Europe? And I think the one thing I'd always go away from is blaming individuals for structural problems. These are structural problems. If you've got a good structure and a watertight system, like some US universities have, every clinical trial result gets made public on time. If you don't have that sort of structure, it's the university's responsibility to make sure that all research conducted under its roof meets ethical requirements, does what's best for patients. It's a structural problem, and I think I think, just this sort of, constructive criticism, and also praising institutions. If institutions do things right, I mean, that's wonderful. We've got some brilliant institutions in Europe now that are doing a huge amount of work on that. And I think you need to give institutions like that public credit, because there's a lot of work behind these improvements, so they really care about patients. They've gone the extra mile.
Yeah. Tom, do you have a comment?
Oh, sure, Carol. Yeah, I was just wondering, Chris Winchester gave some interesting responses, which are worth everyone looking in the chat to one of my questions. But I was just thinking, one of the remarks reminded me of seeing a curriculum vitae of various local clinical experts in our part of the world, and noticing, oh, look at that. He was involved in a clinical trial of a numbered drug for Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure we never heard about that drug. The conclusion I draw is that there was a negative trial, but no one was ever allowed to know the results other than possibly the investigators and certainly the sponsor. Does anyone think there would be a way to oblige universities or their human subjects committees to disclose how many trials they've approved, or even in a particular area, and how many results have been published versus not published?
Well, my impression is that ethics committees tend to be pretty tricky in terms of allowing people access to their data. But you could try that through freedom of information request if you've got appropriate legislation. I mean, another very telling freedom of information request is you can just file a freedom of information request with a university and say, can you please give me a list of all clinical trials that you've initiated over the last 5 years and the registry number, and if available, the publication. And sometimes the answer you get back, or usually the answer you get back if they haven't worked on it, is we simply don't know. And then at least okay, you're dealing with an institution here that will probably need quite a lot of support to put a good system into place.
Yeah, super interesting. All right, well, I think we're wrapping up. If there's any last questions or comments, we could take it now, but otherwise we'll all just wait a minute, see if there's anything else. If not, I'd like to really thank you, Till. It was a wonderful presentation. I really loved your examples, actually. It really just kind of drove it home for me, like, the seriousness of this and how it's a huge problem for us. So thank you so much for presenting today.
Yeah, pleasure. And I mean, going forward, if you want things to change in Canada, it's nobody's going to change it for you. You just need to actually start doing it yourself. And I mean, the experience from Europe, at least, is that it's a downhill battle. I've never worked in an area before where you can achieve so much positive change with so little input.
Yeah, actually, do you have time? There's somebody who put their hand up, Bassi Edem.
Hi to you and
Hey,
everyone. Yeah, thank you very, very, very concise presentation. That was really helpful. I'm just wondering if you can comment on the situation of for this whole transparency and reporting of clinical trial results for low-income countries, sub-Saharan Africa, for example. I understand this is probably out of the mandate for this presentation, but given your experience, do you see you have three systems? What is your
Well, I think this is like a huge knowledge gap. And I mean, for all academic researchers who are listening in on this, I'd really encourage you to look at it, because I know that in India there's been quite a lot published around this. There is a small group of academics and journalists in India who are doing really good research on this topic. And in India, it's not looking good. In China, I'm not aware of any publications, but I assume that's because they're in Chinese language, so I simply can't access them. For the rest of the world, it really is a blank space, and it's something that people haven't focused on because a large majority of clinical trials get run in OECD countries, plus China, plus India. So if you look at the total amount of clinical trials that are actually registered in Africa and run in Africa, it's really small. So I mean, there we're at the point where we don't even have like the first academic paper to work off. I think it's huge blank. I mean, I might have missed some publications. I'm sure some people have done something on it, but generally speaking, low and middle income countries, we just don't know what's happening there.